They're really going completely crazy now. The German federal government actually wants to be able to access German citizens' bank accounts directly in the future, and not because of tax evasion, money laundering, or crime, but simply because your money has been sitting there for too long. Yes, you heard that right. If you let your money sit around for too long in the future, the German state will just take it, and the reasons they give are honestly ridiculous. We can also see the article about it here. New plan. Government wants to siphon money directly from citizens' accounts. But apparently, we're supposed to feel lucky because the government plans to put the money toward a good cause. Specifically, it's supposed to be invested in innovative social funds. We're talking about billions at risk here, and they're crossing lines that really shouldn't be crossed. We're going to take a closer look at the whole topic, so drop a like down below if you don't want the state to overstep its bounds, if you stand for freedom and self-determination, and if you haven't subscribed yet, then of course, that subscribe button too. It's really important that we keep up the momentum here, and that these videos reach as many people as possible. But let's take a quick look at what exactly this is all about. Right now, billions of euros are just sitting passively in German bank accounts. The federal government wants to channel this kind of money into a new fund for social innovation in the future. Which bank customers and accounts are being targeted here? That's the big question here. It's also important to note that this isn't a law yet. It's just a declaration of intent, which is why the Banking Association is now criticizing it in an effort to stop this plan. And we should also put things into perspective a bit. It doesn't mean that all accounts are going to be expropriated or anything like that. We're talking about so-called, let me show you, so-called inactive accounts. And at the same time, the question is, what time period actually qualifies an account as inactive? There's still no clear definition for that. For example, if someone leaves their money untouched for 20 years, then it could just be expropriated. If they leave it untouched for 10 years, or even 5 years, then it could be expropriated. There were also some statements like that from Friedrich Merz. Yeah, he said, we need to mobilize the savings of German citizens. This is obviously heading in a similar direction. And the big problem is that they're setting the threshold pretty high here. At first, maybe, I could imagine, they'll say, okay, if the money has been sitting there for 30 years, then we'll take it. And the problem is the direction this is heading. That means a line is basically being crossed here. And that's also mentioned in the article. A line is being crossed here, one that might be very hard to reverse later on, because they start off with a really big, generous limit, 30 years, 20 years, if money has been sitting around for 5 years, and then they keep lowering the threshold, just like they did with cash. And what starts today with unclaimed accounts could end tomorrow with access to your savings under the pretense of climate protection, social innovation, and wealth redistribution. So that's the next issue. First, they can keep lowering the time limits, and second, once it works for so-called unclaimed accounts, they can easily change the conditions as well. Suddenly, it's not just unclaimed accounts anymore, but also, for example, accounts that are misallocated or accounts belonging to people who wear the wrong sweaters, and much more. And then, there are even more great tools like digital IDs and CBDCs, which could be perfectly linked together for this purpose. The article also states that, according to Hoche, an expert mentioned here, another legal issue is that the plan constitutes an infringement on the property rights of the testator or the bank customer, who might not necessarily even be deceased. So even here, it's based on the assumption that only deceased individuals are affected by these measures, at least in part. But then, there are also errors and so on. Or it could be that mistakes happen here. The fact that something like this is even being discussed is actually a really problematic issue. And that's exactly the topic I keep explaining to you all the time. Expropriation doesn't just happen overnight, where suddenly all your assets are gone. It always happens gradually. First, there's a bit of inflation. Then we introduce money with an expiration date. And then we add accounts with expiration dates. So if someone leaves their money sitting around for too long, that's a problem. And yeah, it's all very critical. And the big question is, what exactly does this sentence mean? The federal government plans to put the money to a good use. So what exactly is considered good here? Who decides what good means here? It's good here, we build roads. It's good here, we build schools. It's good here, we build bonds. What exactly is good in this context? Of course, some central authority will define that, and that's definitely something to be viewed critically. And here, property rights are clearly being disregarded, and we're seeing this more and more. These are failing systems, and we're simply at a turning point where the economy is no longer moving forward. Maybe it's getting hard to really get the country back on track, and instead of improving ourselves, instead of taking Germany to the next level, fostering innovation, and creating good conditions, They just make things harder for people. For example, by demanding even more taxes, by setting up exit barriers, by basically punishing people for certain things. That means we're basically going exactly the wrong way. Instead of creating incentives, we keep trying to tighten the screws even more. And in my opinion, that's always the wrong approach. You should always improve the system through voluntary participation, not by forcing people to stay, or by preventing them from saving or building wealth through coercion. Another criticism mentioned in the article was, and there's a quote about this, even when the owner has passed away, it first has to be clarified whether there are any heirs. And the whole thing here offers no protection for heirs. So, you just don't really know for sure. Even if, for example, there are 5 or 6 heirs or something like that, it's kind of understandable. In that case, you just let the money sit there. Then later on, it's like, no, sorry, Eric can't have the money because the person who passed away just let the money sit there for 10 years and they should have done something with it or bought something with it or whatever. I don't know. I don't get it either. I mean, that's what a bank account is for. A bank account is there so you can basically put money in it and just let it sit there, and that's totally fine. I mean, look, it's just like with Bitcoin. How many people actually plan to, for example, hold on to Bitcoin and let it sit for 20, 30, 40 years? Michael Saylor says he wants to hold on to his Bitcoin forever, even take it to the grave with him if necessary. And that's exactly the genius of Bitcoin. That's why we have Bitcoin. Once we have it, we put it on a hardware wallet. And some people even set up a link to a trusty hardware wallet. I always say, just put your Bitcoin on a hardware wallet. Don't leave them on exchanges, because things like this can happen. At some point, it might not just be, okay, the money in the account has been sitting here too long. But eventually it could be, the Bitcoin on the exchange has been sitting there too long. And then the government comes along and says, like Friedrich Merz, well, we need a few more trillion for some kind of bazooka or whatever. And that's the crazy thing. With Bitcoin, we can just put it on a hardware wallet. No one can censor it, no one can take it away, and so on. Because with that, we truly have self-custody. And as soon as you have something visible to the government, for example, in a bank account, or even Bitcoin on an exchange, or it could be real estate, or a stock portfolio, and so on, then, of course, someone might eventually get the bright idea, okay, hey, the stock portfolio will be frozen for such and such a period. We can just censor the money here. I mean, just ask Warren Buffett. For example, he's also a long-term holder. He holds on to stocks for a very, very long time, and so on. If someone were to just say now, okay, you've held on for too long, we're going to censor your stock holdings now, or someone else's, who simply doesn't know that Bitcoin exists. For example, I know my grandma, she was always very, very hardworking her whole life, but she never really understood, that you should actually exchange fiat money for assets. For example, if my grandma, for example, had just been smart enough to exchange her fiat money for gold, she would probably be a multi-millionaire now. No problem. And yeah, she definitely would have achieved a very, very high level of wealth just by working a really simple job. I mean, she did have real estate, so that was all cool, but she really underperformed compared to what she could have actually done if, instead of just putting her money in the bank for 40 years, or sometimes even under her mattress, she had put it into gold. I mean, she did her best. Much love to my grandma. It's all good, best grandma in the world. But often, it's just a matter of not knowing, and in the future, when you have retirees or something like that, you just say, okay, hey, grandma just didn't know any better. She didn't know where to put her money. She didn't know that there was gold, that there was Bitcoin, that there were stocks, or maybe other assets. She doesn't have to just let it sit around for 30 years, because she doesn't have any other use for it. And then the state just comes along and says, okay, sorry bro, but we have to get at your money now. You just didn't do anything with it for too long. And that's exactly what Orwell and others talk about. Nightmares, discipline, and so on, things like money with an expiration date and so forth. And that's exactly the direction things are heading here. For example, what's also interesting is that we can take a look at what currently happens with money in a bank account. According to an article, which I'll link for you below, it says, under current law and general civil regulations, even when the account holder has died, it first has to be clarified whether there are any heirs. If that's not the case, the money goes to the state. However, if the states do not claim the inheritance, the claim expires after 30 years. Then, according to Finance Tip, banks have to write off the amounts and declare them as profit for tax purposes. However, if the owner suddenly shows up and demands their deposits back, the banks are still obligated to pay out the money. Whether this would still be the case under the new regulations remains to be seen. So it's just like this. If no one can be found here and the money is simply honorless, then in the worst case, it eventually goes to the bank. But even if 50 or 60 years later, someone comes along, as I understand it here, and says, hey, that's my money, then the bank basically has to write it off again and pay it back to that person. And yeah, it's just a really, really strange situation. And maybe just one last thing here, very briefly. What is also recognized here? What is becoming a major problem? What we have here is simply a dangerous precedent for future account seizures. And it also says here, so far, there is no general legal regulation. For now, one is being planned for the future. That means we now have the first law here. And often that's just a trial balloon. And if it goes through, then the next step could easily follow. Access to basic savings accounts. Access when certain account balances are reached. That could be another scenario. Now, for example, they might say, okay, you didn't hold it for too long, but you have too much money in your account. Access to unproductive private assets under the pretense of social innovation. And yes, the next step might be a bit of social redistribution as a moral justification. The money is supposed to be put toward a good cause, and that's always how it goes. They say the same thing in socialism. Yes, we have to take your house away, we have to expropriate it, just to, basically, to ensure better conditions, and so on. And I can only say one thing in conclusion. Folks, get your money out of sight, away from the state, maybe even out of the banking system. Alternatives like Bitcoin, alternatives like gold. Yes, stocks are of course also a certain kind of protection, but I would say not quite as strong as, for example, Bitcoin and gold. Gold should only be kept in physical form, and Bitcoin, of course, only in self-custody, not on some exchange or anything like that. That should be absolutely clear. If you're still looking for a way to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link for you below, 121st Bitcoin. Here you can buy Bitcoin easily, securely, and simply. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. So check it out. Just set up a savings plan and let it run, or do a one-time transfer, or whatever works for you. Take a look and think about your strategy. Yeah, things are getting crazier and crazier. Guys, let me know what you think about all this. See you guys. Until then, peace out.